All of what I will be saying is what I have distilled through my own experience to be the fundamentals of training and how I approach it. This is for those of you training with the intention to grow and will be relevant throughout the entirety of your training life cycle. As such, this will apply to all levels of experience, either laying a foundation for those who are newer to the gym or a reminder for those who are more experienced. I will not be differentiating between strength and hypertrophy, but instead providing a framework so that you can make your own decisions and apply these understandings to your own training methods and goals. Training is relatively simple and straightforward in concept, more nuanced in practice. So we first need to lay some groundwork for everything else to be built upon. How resistance training works is that your natural state is to remain as is, and your body will only change if there's a need. So your goal is to essentially force yourself to grow. Training is what gives your body a stimulus to trigger that growth response, to meet and adapt to the demands that you've placed on it, so that in the future you are better able to handle that demand. To illustrate how the training process works, there is a theoretical model called the SRA curve. SRA standing for its 3 phases: stimulus, recovery, and adaptation. You can visually represent the SRA curve with a graph where the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents performance or level of fitness for your desired adaptation. So that would be strength, hypertrophy, conditioning, technique, etc. So phase 1 would be stimulus, thus fatigue. So you can actually break this down into phase 1A stimulus and phase 1B fatigue, which I will get to shortly. But this is your actual training. Caveat is that your training needs to have an appropriate amount of effort and or be sufficiently challenging. Too much is unnecessary and can actually be counterproductive. Too little and there's no trigger, nothing happens. So you need to overreach just enough that you disrupt your baseline level of fitness. The right dose will inherently generate some degree of fatigue and cause a temporary drop in performance. This leads to the next phase, recovery, where, as the name suggests, your body rebuilds and recovers from training, dissipates fatigue, and returns to baseline. This is affected by things such as diet and nutrition, sleep, rest days, and even any life stressors. So recovery can have both a physical and mental component. As with training stimulus, you can have too much or too little. Proper recovery should set you up for phase 3, adaptation, which is growth beyond your initial capabilities, leading to a new, higher baseline level of fitness. This is also where you introduce the next training stimulus, but of greater demand. And with subsequent workouts, the cycle repeats and should ideally trend upwards. Because of the cyclical nature of the training process, and that your body eventually becomes accustomed to whatever conditions it is presented with, your training stimulus will naturally need to increase and become more challenging over time if you want to keep growing. This is basically what constitutes progression and is what you can call progressive overload. Repeating the same stimulus forever will lead to no progress because your body will adapt just enough to handle that specific stimulus, but not anymore. and stopping completely will just lead to regression. Before moving on to the next section, I do want to go back a little to the graph of the SRA curve. Something I want to highlight because I feel it tends to get overlooked is the importance of the x-axis. Training is also a function of time. So training is something that happens over time. It is an accumulation of sessions, of fatigue, and of adaptations, where fluctuations are both normal and inevitable the longer you train. But what really matters is what happens over a period of time. So you really need to see training through a wider lens for it to mean something of value. So now that we've broken down how resistance training works, variables to manipulate to find the right dose in training, there are three main ones: volume, intensity, and frequency. So how much, how heavy, and how often. Volume is commonly your sets, your reps, and your weight. So the amount of work you're doing. Intensity, depending on your goals, if they skew more towards strength or more towards hypertrophy, can be your level of effort, proximity to failure, or percent of your 1 rep max, or XRM, if measuring as a multiple rep max. Frequency is the number of sessions that you train a certain muscle or movement within a given period, typically a week. I personally do it as the opposite. So instead of measuring frequency by stimulus, I measure it by recovery. So it would be the number of rest days between the sessions that I train a certain muscle or movement. It's the same outcome. I just frame it differently because it makes more sense for the way that I train. So volume, intensity, and frequency, you can think of these three variables as dials that you can adjust up or down according to your needs. Generally, if you increase one or two variables, you need to decrease the remaining. Likewise, if you decrease one or two, you have more room to increase the remaining, because assuming you are training with effort, dialing up all three is doable short term, but not sustainable and not without consequences. And I'll say that again. Assuming you are training with effort, dialing up all three is doable, but not sustainable and not without consequences. This includes things like overtraining, burnout, illness, and injuries, which can be far more detrimental to your training than you may realize or want to accept. So you need to pick your priority and or preference and find a balance for long-term progress. So how to know if training is the right dose? A few conditions, one being that it is when you can maintain safe form and acceptable technique. The adjectives that I used, safe is non-negotiable, but technique won't always be perfect, especially when you are pushing higher effort work. It just needs to be acceptable for whatever standards you are using. Another condition is that it is when you are making progress. For me, if something is working, I don't change it. I have always been this way in the gym and will even admit that sometimes I can be a little stubborn and won't even change something if it is not working. So maybe don't do that. But if you're not making progress, there is a progress flowchart from a book called The Muscle and Strength Pyramid, the training edition. I came upon this relatively recently, in the past few years maybe, and I haven't seen the rest of the book, so I can't speak to that. But the chart might have been the first time that I saw how I was more or less going about it, just presented in a more organized format. It is a pretty decent reference for its logical flow if you're trying to troubleshoot your progress. And although I haven't found it 100% accurate or applicable to my experience, it will probably help as a starting point in most situations. The last condition, I originally wasn't sure whether I wanted to include this one because I wanted to try and keep this video more informative, I guess. But it made me feel like something was missing, so I want to at least mention it briefly because I think it's important. But it's when you enjoy training and you hear this so much that it has lost its meaning. So I'm going to rephrase it in a way that resonates with me so that it is when you get a sense of fulfillment from the training process, not necessarily day to day, but overall. One more layer. Your training is the right dose when training adds to your life instead of taking away from it. You can apply this to anything in life really, but leaving it there, just something to think about. One overarching thing to keep in mind, I mentioned at the beginning that training is relatively simple and straightforward in concept, more nuanced in practice. This is because training is individual and can change. There are way too many personal variables that can affect what your training looks like, how you'll respond, what kind of progress you'll make, and even when. Which is why there was no mention of things like training splits, exercise selection, or more concrete numbers, such as number of reps or rest times, which I also think are all aspects that are secondary to what I have talked about. But even on an individual level, your training can change over the course of your training life cycle. What won't change are the training principles themselves. They will still apply in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. Last I checked, evolution doesn't change that fast. But building strength and muscle, you need to understand how it happens and why it happens. The rest, more challenging part, is figuring out how to make it happen, and will likely be an ongoing process of fine-tuning the balance between training and recovery in a way that best suits your own individual needs and goals. So hopefully I've shared something that you found worth taking away from this video and are able to make your own training work for you. So have fun.